When I fell off my rollerblades near the fence between our yards, I didn't cry out. I didn't want to wake him. My husband was asleep inside, the TV humming beside him like a lullaby. I lay on the ground, stunned more by the loneliness than the fall, and then I saw a shadow leaning over me. It was him. The neighbor. His hands, warm and steady, reached for mine. And that was the first time I felt alive in weeks. Not because he was handsome or younger, but because he looked at me. Really looked. Like I mattered. Like I wasn't invisible. I laughed to cover the heat in my chest, but his eyes didn't waver. He lifted me up with such gentleness that I forgot the scrape on my leg and noticed instead the pulse in my neck. I should have walked straight back to my house. But I didn't. I lingered at the gate. I watched his lips move as he spoke, even if I didn't really hear his words. And in that moment, I knew something dangerous had begun. Not an affair. Not yet. But a ripple. A shift. A possibility. You might think you'd never do something like this. That you'd never risk the life you built. I thought so too. Until the silence in my house became louder than any scream. Until the nights grew so long I forgot what it felt like to be wanted. So before I tell you what happened between us, and what it cost me, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And answer this honestly, have you ever done something you never thought you would, just because someone finally made you feel seen? It started with the sound of my own breath. Shallow, careful, almost hesitant, as if I were afraid to inhale too much and disturb the stillness I'd become a part of. That morning, the sun filtered through the curtains in thick golden lines, falling across the floor like bars. I watched them from the edge of the bed, not moving, just listening to the faint wheeze of the ceiling fan and the occasional rustle from the garden outside. My husband was snoring softly beside me, one hand resting on his chest, the other limp against the edge of the blanket. It wasn't that he was a bad man. He wasn't cruel or unfaithful. He paid the bills, mowed the lawn, and brought me tea on weekends. But somewhere along the line, we had become two bodies sharing a schedule, not a life. I could barely remember the last time he looked at me with curiosity. Or hunger. Or anything at all that resembled intimacy. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. The tiles in the hallway felt cold against my bare feet. I passed the photos on the wall, our wedding in faded sepia, his graduation, that vacation we took to the mountains years ago. My reflection caught in the glass, and for a second, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her face seemed softer than mine. Her eyes more tired. In the kitchen, I reached for the cupboard above the fridge. Behind the cereal boxes and expired vitamins was a dusty pair of rollerblades. I hadn't worn them in years. But something about this morning, something invisible and urgent, pushed me to lace them up. I told myself it was for exercise. But the truth was, I needed to feel something different. Something new. Outside, the world smelled like cut grass and warming pavement. I rolled slowly along the edge of the garden, finding my balance, reacquainting my body with the rhythm of movement. I passed the lilac bush that never bloomed anymore, the chipped bird bath my husband swore he'd fix but never did. Then it happened. A sudden shift in weight. A pebble beneath my right wheel. I tilted, arms flailing, and landed hard on the ground with a thud that echoed louder in my chest than in my ears. Pain flared up my side. Not unbearable, but enough to take my breath. I blinked against the sunlight, trying to gather myself, when a voice cut through the haze. "Are you okay?" He was there. The neighbor. Just a few feet away, crouched beside me with concern etched into every line of his face. I tried to sit up, but he gently reached out. "Wait. Let me help." His hands were warm and dry, strong but not forceful. He lifted me with surprising ease, steadying me by the elbow, his other hand hovering just near my waist but not touching. I caught a whiff of cedar and soap. Familiar but not mine. I didn't think anyone saw, I murmured, brushing dirt from my knees. He smiled, crooked, a little boyish. Well, I was trimming the hedge. Guess it's a good thing I was. We stood awkwardly near the gate, the boundary that both separated and connected our lives. Behind me, the house lay silent, the blinds drawn. My husband, still asleep inside, oblivious. You want to sit for a minute? I can get you some ice, the neighbor offered. I hesitated. It was just a scrape. And yet, the idea of not going back inside right away felt necessary. I'm okay, I said. But I didn't move. Neither did he. We stood like that, suspended in the warmth of early morning and something unspoken. I've seen you rollerblade before, he said. You used to do it all the time. I blinked. How would you know? He shrugged. I notice things. The words hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't used to being noticed. You've got a good stride, he added. Even in the fall. I laughed, short and breathless. Well, that's something. We talked a little longer. About the weather. His new garden project. Nothing important. And yet every word felt like a tether being tied between us. When I finally turned to go, I felt his eyes on my back. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me feel present. Real. Inside, the house felt colder. The TV was still playing an infomercial on mute. My husband had shifted positions, his mouth slightly open. I stood there for a moment, watching him sleep, trying to remember what it felt like to be in love with him. I couldn't. Later, I sat on the edge of the bathtub, examining the scrape on my leg. A small thing. But the bruise went deeper than skin. I didn't know what any of it meant yet. Or where it would go. But I knew I would rollerblade again tomorrow. The next morning, I avoided the garden. I stayed inside, pretending to be busy. I folded laundry that didn't need folding, rearranged spice jars in alphabetical order, and wiped down already clean countertops. Every time I passed by the window, my eyes flicked toward the yard next door, searching for a glimpse of him. But when I saw the hedge trimmer leaning against the fence and no sign of him, a strange mix of relief and disappointment settled in my chest. The scrape on my leg throbbed mildly, but that wasn't what kept me restless. It was the feeling left behind from yesterday. The way he looked at me. The silence that lingered after our brief conversation. I hadn't told my husband about the fall. He hadn't asked. When he finally woke up, he mumbled something about a strange dream, shuffled into the kitchen for coffee, and didn't notice the bandage on my knee. I didn't offer an explanation. By mid-morning, I sat at the dining table, flipping through a magazine without seeing a single word. The house was still. Only the ticking of the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator filled the air. I tried to remind myself that nothing had happened. He helped me stand. We talked. That was all. But deep down, I knew it was more. Not in action, but in meaning. I stood abruptly and grabbed the watering can. The garden needed tending, and I needed something to do with my hands. Outside, the sun was gentler than yesterday, filtered through a thin layer of clouds. I walked slowly, deliberately, hoping that maybe I'd hear his voice again. That maybe he'd be out, too. But the yard next door was quiet. As I bent to water the rosebush, I noticed a small terracotta pot placed just beside the shared fence. Inside it, a tiny succulent sat neatly in the soil, its plump leaves arranged like petals. Taped to the side of the pot was a small folded note. My name was written on it. Just my name. I looked around instinctively, but the yard remained empty. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the note. Unfolding it, I read just 4 words, "For your sore knees, smiley face." There was no signature. But I didn't need one. A smile crept onto my lips before I could stop it. I held the note between my fingers, rereading it. The pot was light, easy to carry. I brought it inside and placed it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where the morning light would hit it. For the first time in what felt like weeks, I found myself humming under my breath as I moved through the kitchen. My husband came in just after noon, phone in hand, his eyes fixed on the screen. He poured himself a glass of water, glanced vaguely in my direction, and said something about needing to fix the garage door next weekend. I nodded, unsure if he noticed the new plant. He didn't ask. He rarely asked about anything anymore. Later in the day, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, the air carrying the scent of cut grass and faint whiffs of grilled food from another neighbor's yard. I told myself I wasn't waiting. That I was just enjoying the breeze. But when I heard the faint creak of his gate, my spine straightened instinctively. He appeared, walking slowly along the edge of his garden, hands in his pockets, gaze lowered. When he reached the fence, he looked up, and our eyes met. There was no smile, no wave, just a pause. A held breath between 2 people who suddenly didn't know how to be casual anymore. I stood, holding the mug close to my chest, as if it offered protection. He stepped a little closer to the fence but didn't speak immediately. "I hope it wasn't too much," he said finally, nodding toward the house, toward the succulent I now realized he could probably see through the window. "It was thoughtful," I replied. My voice felt unfamiliar in my throat, too soft, too warm. He leaned against the fence with the same quiet ease he always seemed to carry. "I didn't mean to make things weird." "They're not weird," I said too quickly. We both laughed, though it wasn't exactly a shared joke. More a release of tension. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" he asked. I hesitated. Then nodded. "I think so." The moment stretched. I felt the weight of it pressing against my skin, against the bandage on my leg, against the silence that always waited for me inside the house. "I should go," I said, though I didn't move. He didn't argue. Just dipped his head slightly and said, "Take care." I turned back toward the house, but something in me wanted to look back. I resisted. That evening, after dinner, my husband dozed on the couch while the television played a documentary on something neither of us were truly watching. I sat beside him, legs tucked under me, wondering what it meant that I had smiled more in the past 2 days than in the last 2 months. I glanced at him, his mouth slightly open, remote still in his hand, the same shirt he wore the day before now wrinkled and untucked. There was no malice in him. Just absence. A quiet kind of forgetting. Upstairs, I washed my face and brushed my hair. The woman in the mirror looked the same, but something had changed. In the lines around her eyes. In the way she held her shoulders. I wondered how long it would take for someone to truly see the difference. Before bed, I checked my phone. No new messages. No missed calls. Just a simple weather notification: clear skies tomorrow, mild breeze. Good for walking. Or rollerblading. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and slipped into bed. My husband stirred slightly, turning away from me, his back rising and falling with each breath. Lying there in the dark, I thought about how simple it had been. A fall. A hand. A note. But beneath that simplicity was something more dangerous. Not in what had happened, but in what now might. I closed my eyes and tried to silence the noise in my head. But the memory of his voice, the warmth of his hand on my elbow, the smile in that small pot by the fence, it all stayed with me. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was filled with images I didn't dare interpret. All I knew was this: tomorrow, I would put on those rollerblades again. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The light outside was still pale, not yet golden, and the house felt suspended in that quiet hour where nothing had quite started. My husband was still asleep, his breathing slow and even. I listened to it for a moment, then sat up, careful not to disturb him. There was no specific plan in my mind, only a restlessness that made staying in bed feel unbearable. Downstairs, the kettle hissed as I leaned against the counter, waiting. The succulent on the windowsill looked content, untouched by the storm inside me. I ran my fingers along the rim of the pot, rereading the note in my mind. For your sore knees. Such a small gesture, yet it had carved a space in me I hadn't realized was hollow. After breakfast, I went into the garage and pulled out my rollerblades again. I checked the straps, tightened them, brushed off a layer of dust from my helmet. I wasn't sure what I was trying to prove, to myself, or to anyone else. Maybe I just wanted to feel the breeze on my skin, the slight ache in my muscles, something tangible to remind me I still existed outside routine. The street was quiet as I glided slowly along the pavement. My legs were steadier than the day before, though I still kept near the curb. A few birds chirped lazily overhead. I made 2 slow loops around the block before turning back onto our street, just in time to see him pulling weeds by his fence. He looked up as I approached, and there was a pause, brief, but full of awareness. I slowed to a stop near the driveway and unstrapped one skate, then the other. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands, and walked over, staying on his side of the fence. "You're back on them already," he said, not quite smiling. "They say you're supposed to get back up after you fall." "That's brave," he replied, his gaze steady. I nodded, unsure how to respond. A breeze moved between us, carrying the scent of mint and earth. He reached down to adjust a piece of twine securing a tomato plant to the trellis. I watched the movement of his hands, their precision and calm, and wondered what they might look like painting or playing piano. Something gentle. "Thanks again." "For the plant," I said. "I thought it might make you smile." It did. There was a quiet between us, not awkward, not tense. Just full. He glanced over his shoulder at his house, then back at me. "I was thinking of building a bench for this spot," he said. "Something small. A place to sit in the evenings." "That sounds nice," I replied. "You always have projects going." "Idle hands," he said lightly. I let out a soft laugh. "Then I must be saintly. I haven't built anything in years." He looked at me with something like curiosity. "Maybe it's time to start." The words weren't charged, not overt. But they landed somewhere deep in me. I felt my face flush slightly and turned toward my own yard. "I should get these back in the garage," I said, lifting the skates. "Of course." I walked away slowly, conscious of each step. When I reached the door, I glanced back. He was still standing there, hands on his hips, looking at the space where the bench might go. Inside, the house felt cooler. My husband was at the kitchen table with his laptop open, tapping at the keyboard. He glanced up when I came in, offered a distracted smile, and returned to his screen. I placed the skates in the closet and went to wash my hands. That afternoon passed in quiet rhythms. I did the laundry, refilled the bird feeder, clipped coupons I didn't need. But my thoughts kept circling back to that fence, that unfinished bench, the way his voice had said, "Maybe it's time to start." Later, while slicing vegetables for dinner, I paused and looked out the window. He was sitting in a folding chair by the fence, a sketchpad resting on his knees. I watched him draw for several minutes before realizing I was holding the knife still in midair. My husband entered the room, talking about a meeting he had tomorrow and asking if we needed anything from the store. I answered on autopilot. The disconnect between us wasn't born of hatred or betrayal, it was quieter, more gradual. Like a slow leak in a tire. One day you realize the pressure is gone, but you're not sure when it started. We ate in silence. He complimented the seasoning on the chicken, and I nodded. Afterward, I offered to wash the dishes, sending him to the living room. The sound of running water filled the space, but I could still hear the faint murmur of the television in the background. When I finally stepped out onto the porch, the air had shifted. The sun was dipping low, and shadows stretched long across the grass. He was still there, by the fence, still sketching. I considered walking over. Saying something. Anything. But I didn't. Instead, I sat on the porch swing and let the motion soothe me. I watched the sky turn a deeper shade of orange and told myself that nothing was happening. That there was no story unfolding. Just two neighbors existing beside each other. And yet, when I went back inside, I found myself placing the sketch pad on the list of things I wanted to ask him about. Right below, what kind of bench? And do you believe in second chances? That night, I took a longer shower than usual. I stood beneath the warm water and let my thoughts drift. I imagined conversations that hadn't happened. I remembered laughter that hadn't been shared in years. I thought of the way my name looked on that note, small and careful. In bed, I faced the ceiling, the darkness heavy but not suffocating. My husband was already asleep, his breathing slow. I turned toward him for a moment, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest. Then I turned away. Outside, somewhere near the fence, I imagined him putting away his sketch pad. I imagined him brushing sawdust from his hands, measuring wood for a future bench. I imagined him seeing me not as a mystery, not as a fantasy, but simply as I was, a flawed, aging, real. And for reasons I couldn't fully explain, that thought made me feel more awake than I had in months. The days began to blur in a rhythm I hadn't noticed forming. Mornings started with quiet rituals, tea in the same chipped mug, the smell of toast, the sound of my husband typing away at his laptop or making small, habitual noises as he read the news aloud. Evenings ended in silence, the television washing over us like static, a hum neither of us listened to. But between those bookends, something else had begun to grow. Not dramatic. Not even deliberate. Just moments. Pieces. And most of them happened near that fence. It was early afternoon when I noticed the first sign of it. A thin strip of wood lay propped against the shared boundary, cleanly cut, sanded smooth. A second one followed the next day, and by the third, a small frame took shape. He wasn't out when I first saw it. But later, through the window, I caught a glimpse of him kneeling, hammer in hand, shirt clinging to his back from the heat. I didn't speak to him that day. I didn't need to. The bench, because of course that's what it was speaking enough. I spent much of that week tidying the house. Not the kind of urgent, guest coming over cleaning, but something slower, almost therapeutic. I opened closets I hadn't looked into in years. I donated boxes of clothes that no longer fit and threw away spices that had expired before my last birthday. Something about making space felt necessary, even if I couldn't say why. One afternoon, as I cleaned out the bottom drawer of the hallway cabinet, I found an old Polaroid tucked between two yellowing instruction manuals. It was of me, much younger, standing at the edge of a lake in a summer dress, my hair windblown, my arms crossed over my chest like I wasn't sure I deserved the picture. I studied it for a long time. Not because I missed that version of myself, but because I suddenly realized how long it had been since anyone looked at me like I was worth photographing. I placed the photo in the drawer again, but this time on top. That evening, I walked outside with a watering can. I didn't need to. It had rained lightly that morning, but I found myself drawn to the garden anyway. As I bent to check the soil near the roses, I heard his voice behind me, soft, almost cautious. "It's finished." I turned. He stood near the bench, one hand on its backrest, the other at his side. The bench wasn't elaborate, simple, made of warm-toned wood, with slightly curved edges and legs dug gently into the grass to keep it stable. "It looks perfect," I said. "It's yours too, you know. It's right between us." I smiled, unsure what to say. I didn't sit down. "Not yet. I've been thinking of painting it," he added. "Maybe a dark green. Or leaving it bare." "Bare feels honest," I said before I could think. He nodded, not looking away. The silence between us was heavier now, not uncomfortable, but expectant. That night, while drying dishes, I caught my reflection in the window and startled myself. My face had more color than usual. My eyes seemed wider. I touched the corner of my mouth and realized I'd been smiling without knowing it. My husband walked in behind me, talking about his brother's upcoming birthday. I responded politely, made the appropriate noises, even laughed once. But inside, I was still on the porch, next to the bench. The next day, I left a note on his side of the fence. Folded twice, simple handwriting. "The bare wood is beautiful. I think it should stay that way." I didn't sign it. By evening, a second note appeared on my windowsill, held down by a small stone. "Some things don't need polish to be worth sitting on." That note I kept. There was a quiet joy in these small exchanges. Nothing overt. Nothing crossing a line. But they lived with me throughout the day. In the way I folded the laundry, in the music I played quietly while cooking, in the extra care I took brushing my hair in the mornings. I wasn't dressing for him. Not exactly. But I wasn't not dressing for him either. Still, I told myself, nothing had happened. And yet, everything had shifted. One morning, my husband mentioned that he'd be away the next weekend, some workshop in another city. He explained the agenda, talked about hotels and presentations, but my mind clung only to the dates. 2 days. Alone. No routine. No expected conversations over dinner. No quiet breathing beside me at night. He asked if I wanted to join, maybe make it a trip, but I declined. I said the garden needed attention. That the weather was too nice to leave. He nodded without pressing. He never did. That evening, I sat on the porch again, near the bench, though still on my side. He came out with a book in his hand, not pretending this time. He walked slowly, nodded once, then sat down on the bench with a sigh, flipping the book open on his lap. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. I read the shadows as they crept across the grass. I noticed how his foot tapped gently to an invisible rhythm. I counted 3 breaths in my chest for every one of his. At one point, he looked up from the pages and met my eyes. There was no smile. No invitation. Just recognition. A mirror. I stood before I could fall into that look too long. I said something about needing to check on the laundry. He raised the book slightly in a wave. I stepped inside. I told myself I hadn't done anything wrong. But later, in the quiet of the night, I replayed every second of that porch scene in my head. I remembered the way his hand curled around the spine of the book. The way he sat with his back slightly hunched, not from tiredness, but from ease. And I remembered, perhaps most vividly, that I wanted to sit beside him. Just once. Even if I never did. Even if I only ever imagined it. That wanting was enough to shift the ground beneath everything else. The day began like any other, with the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of pipes behind the kitchen wall. I stood by the window, cradling a warm mug in both hands, watching the morning sunlight filter through the trees. The bench sat in its place, empty and quiet, but somehow it held a kind of presence now, like a third figure in the silent conversations between our homes. My husband left for work with the usual rustle of papers and a distracted goodbye. I watched him pull out of the driveway, the tires making soft impressions in the gravel. As his car turned the corner, I stood still for a long moment, the air thick with something I couldn't quite name. The house exhaled its silence again, swallowing his absence like it was used to it. By mid-morning, I had finished the laundry and tried reading, but the words blurred and lost shape before they reached me. I walked into the garden with a pair of clippers, trimming leaves that didn't need trimming, brushing my fingers over petals already in bloom. Every motion was careful, deliberate. I felt restless, but there was nowhere to place it. Then I heard his voice, carried lightly on the breeze. "Morning." I turned to find him standing on the other side of the fence, his hands dusted with soil. He wore a plain t-shirt, and a smudge of dirt crossed his forearm. There was something deeply human in the way he looked, simple, unguarded. "Morning," I replied, feeling the warmth rise in my chest faster than the sun could explain. He gestured behind him toward a small row of potted herbs. "I was going to drop some off." "Too many for one person." "Too many's a good problem," I said. "I'll bring them over." I hesitated but nodded. A few minutes later, he appeared on my side of the fence, a shallow wooden crate in his arms filled with sprigs of rosemary, mint, and thyme. He knelt near my garden and set the crate down gently, brushing off his hands on his pants before standing. We didn't move. We didn't speak. The moment stretched, and I knew something was building inside me, something that had less to do with him and more to do with what I hadn't let myself feel in years. I bent down toward the crate, fingers tracing over the mint leaves, breathing in the scent. "They're beautiful," I said. "You should have something alive in your kitchen," he replied. "Something that responds when you touch it." The air between us changed. Not suddenly, but subtly. Like a window had opened without warning, letting in a current we couldn't pretend not to notice. I looked up at him, standing so close. There was no pretense in his face, no mask. Just honesty. And, maybe, recognition. We kissed. It didn't last long. It wasn't planned. It wasn't desperate or wild. It was still. And quiet. And final in the way that first acknowledgments often are. I didn't pull away because there was nothing in me that wanted to. And when it ended, we both stood in that stillness, eyes open. I touched my own lips lightly, as if to confirm it had happened. He took a step back, respectful, not apologizing, not explaining. "I should get back to the herbs," he said, his voice low. "I know." And then he was gone, slipping around the side of the fence, leaving the scent of rosemary and something else I couldn't name in his wake. I stood alone for several minutes, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the crate. My thoughts were louder now, echoing through the quiet spaces of the house. It hadn't felt like a betrayal. Not in the way the world would define it. It had felt like a response. Like I had finally answered a question that had been asked in silence for far too long. Inside, I washed my hands slowly, watching the water swirl around the mint stems I'd brought in with me. I placed the herbs in a ceramic vase on the windowsill, beside the succulent, and for a moment, I simply stood there, letting the sun hit my face. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't plan anything. But I noticed how I moved through the rest of the day, lighter, but not careless. I folded towels more neatly. I set the table with 2 glasses, even though I knew only one would be used tonight. I cooked dinner with fresh thyme, and the house smelled different, warmer, fuller. When my husband returned home, he noticed the scent and said something about how it reminded him of his mother's kitchen. I smiled, nodded. I didn't tell him where the herbs came from. He talked about work as we ate, about a colleague's promotion, about a delay on a shipment. I listened, nodding in the right places, answering when prompted. The rhythm of our dinner was unchanged, but I was aware now of how much space lived between us. How much went unsaid. How long it had been since either of us asked the other what they were feeling, instead of just assuming everything was fine. Later that night, after he had fallen asleep, I stepped out onto the porch. The bench was still visible from where I stood, bathed in the soft blue of twilight. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and sat on the swing, rocking slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot where he had stood earlier that day. The kiss lingered in my thoughts, not for its intensity, but for its simplicity. It hadn't changed everything, but it had cracked something open. A sealed jar on a high shelf, untouched for years. I closed my eyes and let the evening wash over me, the crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of a branch in the breeze. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt awake. Present in a way I hadn't in years. And for now, that was enough. The morning after the kiss passed with an eerie sort of normalcy. I went through the motions, made breakfast, watered the plants, folded a small load of laundry. But everything felt fractionally off, as though the world had shifted a few degrees and I was the only one who noticed. My husband stirred his coffee in the same slow circles he always did, flipping through a newspaper he barely read. I watched him from across the table, searching his face for signs, anything that might hint he knew something had changed. But he was the same. Or at least, he appeared to be. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe we had both become so good at our routines that even seismic changes could slip by unnoticed. After he left for work, I found myself standing at the sink again, hands submerged in dishwater, staring out at the fence. The bench sat quietly beneath the sycamore tree, the light playing off its surface. I hadn't seen him since yesterday afternoon. No notes, no glances across the yard. Just stillness. I tried to distract myself. I vacuumed, rearranged books, wiped every countertop twice. But the quiet between our houses felt louder than it ever had before. At one point, I considered baking something with the rosemary he'd brought, but the idea felt too intimate, too performative, so I let it go. Around midday, I stepped outside under the pretense of checking the mail. The box was empty. I lingered anyway, my eyes drifting to the neighbor's window, half hoping he might be there. But the curtains were drawn. I stood there for a long moment before turning back toward the porch. That afternoon, clouds gathered overhead, thick and low, casting the entire street in a dull gray. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the wind chimes that hung from our eaves. I sat on the swing and let it move me back and forth, trying to quiet the anxious rhythm building inside my chest. At some point, I heard the faint buzz of his saw from the garage, the soft thud of wood being shifted. It grounded me. Reminded me that he was still there, still moving through the day, even if our shared silence now held a different weight. Later, after dinner, my husband settled into the living room and turned on a documentary. I cleared the plates without comment and stepped outside under the growing darkness. The bench was there, exactly as before. It hadn't moved, but everything around it had. I walked slowly toward it, feeling the grass damp under my feet from the earlier drizzle. When I reached it, I sat down carefully, my fingers tracing the edge of the seat. The wood was smooth and cool to the touch. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood, the soft thrum of insects, the distant murmur of a television, a dog barking somewhere down the street. When I opened my eyes, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of his yard, one hand resting on the back of his own chair, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I didn't speak. Neither did he. But we stayed there, separated by a few feet of space and something else, something far less measurable. Eventually, I stood and nodded once before retreating into the house. My husband was still watching TV, eyes heavy. I moved past him without a word, climbed the stairs, and sat on the edge of our bed. I felt like I was carrying something delicate, something not yet defined. The next day passed in quiet. No notes. No shared moments. I saw him once through the kitchen window, trimming his hedge. He didn't look up. I didn't wave. In the early evening, while my husband was on a call, I stepped out to the bench again. The air was heavy, the light strange, one of those dusks where the sun tries to push through but gives up halfway. I sat, letting the weight of the past few days settle over me. I wasn't sure what I expected. I didn't know if I wanted a conversation, an explanation, or simply to sit beside something that had become a symbol of something unspoken. And then I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. I didn't turn. I just waited. He sat beside me, but left enough space between us for the night air to breathe. Neither of us said anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. Eventually, he spoke, his voice quiet and steady. That wasn't a mistake. I nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. I know. But it changes things. Yes, I said. We sat in the stillness of that agreement. No plans. No decisions. Just the reality that something had been acknowledged and couldn't be undone. After a long pause, he stood and walked away, not looking back. I remained on the bench, the air cooling around me, the shadows deepening. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there, listening to the echo of his steps retreating and feeling the strange, heavy clarity that often comes after a moment of honesty. Back inside, my husband had already gone to bed. I moved quietly through the house, brushing my fingers along the back of the couch, the edge of the table, the smooth curve of the banister. Everything looked the same. Everything felt different. In the bathroom, I washed my face and stared at my reflection for a long time. I didn't look guilty. I didn't look triumphant. I just looked like myself, aged a little more by truth than by time. That night, I lay in bed wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my body perfectly still beneath the covers. My husband turned in his sleep, his arm brushing mine. I didn't move. I wasn't sure what we were anymore, me and my husband, me and the man next door, me and myself. But I knew this, something had been set into motion. And no matter how quietly it unfolded, it would not stop now. The morning started with an unusual kind of silence, not the habitual kind I'd grown used to over the years, the one that nestled itself between me and my husband like a sleeping animal, but a thicker, more fragile quiet, like a sheet of glass waiting to be shattered. He was still in bed when I got up, sprawled diagonally across the mattress, his arm draped carelessly over my side of the bed. I slipped out from beneath it gently, careful not to wake him. Downstairs, the air felt cooler than usual. I opened a window in the kitchen to let in the breeze, watching the curtains rise and fall as if breathing. The bench outside was damp with dew, and the grass glistened faintly in the early light. I found myself staring at the space between our houses again, that narrow stretch of fence and air that now held a history I didn't fully understand, a meaning I couldn't name. I didn't see him that morning. Not in the yard. Not through the kitchen window. Not in passing. A part of me had expected that. After what we'd shared, however small it seemed on the surface, the absence felt louder. Intentional. My husband left around mid-morning for a dental appointment. He didn't kiss my cheek or say when he'd be back. I didn't ask. It was strange how much space could grow between two people sharing the same roof, how many conversations could go unspoken just by habit alone. When the front door closed behind him, I exhaled. It was a quiet, personal relief, not about escape, but about being able to move freely within my own home. I turned off the TV, made myself a second cup of tea, and took it out to the porch. The air smelled like wet wood and cut grass. I sat on the swing, letting the breeze rock me slowly. The warmth of the mug seeped into my palms. I noticed that the gate between our yards was slightly ajar, just enough to catch my attention. It wasn't like that yesterday. Curiosity pushed me to stand. I set the mug down, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked across the lawn. When I reached the gate, I paused. The silence between our homes felt dense again, but not hollow. It held something unspoken. Something waiting. I pushed the gate open gently and stepped through. His back was to me. He was sitting on the steps leading up to his back door, elbows resting on his knees, fingers interlaced. He didn't turn when he heard the gate, but I knew he'd heard it. I stopped a few feet away, uncertain whether I should say anything. The moment stretched. Then, without looking at me, he spoke. "She's coming by later." My sister. I blinked, caught off guard by the suddenness of it. His voice was calm, but there was something in it, tension, maybe, or restraint. "I see," I said quietly. "She asked to use the guest room for a night." I didn't say no. I nodded, even though he still wasn't looking. "Of course." He finally turned then, his expression unreadable but not cold. Just distant enough to remind me that there were walls we couldn't cross, no matter what had passed between us. "I thought it was better to mention it," he said. I appreciated that. I wasn't sure why it stung. It shouldn't have. "Thanks," I said simply. He stood, brushing his hands against his pants. "It's a good day to stay indoors. Might rain." I looked up. The sky was indeed turning that particular shade of gray that always precedes a storm. "I should go back," I said. He nodded, and I walked back through the gate, closing it behind me this time. By mid-afternoon, the clouds were thicker. The wind picked up, knocking over a few flower pots near the porch. I picked them up and placed them under the awning, just in time for the first heavy drops of rain to hit the ground. Inside, I stood by the window, watching the rain fall in steady sheets. The bench blurred behind the glass. The space between the houses disappeared under the storm. And then the power went out. It happened in a soft click, the kind of silence that's immediate and complete. No fridge hum, no ceiling fan. Just the rain. I waited a few minutes, then checked my phone. No signal. I wasn't sure if it was the storm or just bad timing. I wandered the house, lighting a few candles, the flicker of flame casting shadows on the walls. My husband still hadn't returned, and without a way to reach him, I could only assume he'd stayed somewhere dry. As the storm rolled on, I sat in the living room with a book I wasn't reading, the candlelight too dim to follow the words. The house felt larger in the quiet, every creak of wood more pronounced. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and listened. Then came the knock. It was soft, tentative. Not on the front door. On the side door, the one that led to the porch. I stood slowly, heart suddenly loud in my chest. When I opened it, he was there. Hair damp, shirt clinging slightly to his back. He held a small flashlight in his hand, the beam pointed at the ground. "Your lights too?" he asked, voice low. I nodded. "Yes." "No signal either." He glanced up at the sky, then back at me. "You're all right?" "I'm fine." We stood like that for a beat too long, both of us aware of the weight in the air, heavier than the clouds. "I just wanted to check," he said. "Thank you." He gave a short nod and turned to go, but before he could step off the porch, thunder cracked close by, and the rain doubled. "Wait," I said, louder than I meant to. You'll get soaked. He stopped, glanced at the sheets of water falling around us. It's fine, he said. But it wasn't. And we both knew it. I stepped aside. Just until it eases. He hesitated. Then stepped in. We stood in the hallway, both slightly damp, both quiet. The candlelight threw soft gold against his face, and I realized how unfamiliar it felt to have him inside my home, how different everything looked with him standing there. I led him to the kitchen, where we sat across from each other at the table. The flashlight lay between us, casting its narrow beam across the wood. We didn't talk about anything significant. Just the storm. The outage. Small, careful words. But underneath each sentence lived another meaning. Another layer. And as the rain softened, as the wind quieted, neither of us moved. When the power came back on with a low hum and flicker, we both blinked at the sudden brightness. He stood first. I should go, he said. I didn't stop him. He walked to the door, turned once to look at me, then stepped out into the night. I closed the door gently behind him and leaned against it, the echo of his presence still in the air. We spent the night together. The morning after was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that soothes or comforts, but the kind that lingers heavily in the air, making everything feel too loud even in silence. I woke before the sun had fully risen, the edges of the room still blurred with shadow. My husband's side of the bed was empty. I didn't remember hearing him come home. Or maybe I had heard, somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, and chosen not to react. I sat up slowly, the sheet slipping from my shoulder. My body felt strange, like I was carrying something invisible, something warm and fragile that hadn't yet settled into meaning. I moved through the morning with a kind of careful detachment. I brushed my teeth. Washed my face. Poured myself coffee. Each action separate from the next, as though the muscle memory of daily life was still operating, even if the rest of me had paused. My husband was in the backyard when I finally stepped into the kitchen. I saw him through the window, standing with his arms crossed, staring at the flower bed that hadn't changed in weeks. His posture was thoughtful but unreadable. When he came inside a few minutes later, he didn't say anything. He moved past me, poured himself coffee, and sat at the table with his phone. We exchanged a few words about the weather. He asked if the internet was back. I said yes. He nodded and returned to his screen. If there was tension, it didn't surface in the usual way. There were no sharp tones, no accusations. Just the sense that something had shifted, and neither of us was ready to name it. I spent most of the day pretending to be busy. I reorganized the pantry, wiped down already clean windows, refolded towels that didn't need folding. I avoided the porch. I avoided the bench. I avoided looking toward the fence. Every time I caught a glimpse of his house, something in my chest tightened. Around noon, my husband left for the hardware store. I didn't ask what he needed. He didn't offer to take me along. The sound of his car pulling away left a strange echo in the house. I stood in the middle of the living room for several minutes, unsure what to do next. I wasn't waiting for anything specific. And yet, I felt suspended in something that refused to resolve. Eventually, I stepped outside. The grass was still damp from the storm, and the sun was trying to push through the thinning clouds. I walked slowly to the bench and sat down, careful not to look toward his house. But even without looking, I felt the absence. The porch across the way was empty. His curtains were closed. A part of me wanted to knock. To speak. To do something that would make sense of what had happened. But I didn't. I stayed on the bench, listening to the breeze move through the trees, trying to slow the spiral of thoughts in my head. When I returned inside, I found a note on the kitchen counter in my husband's handwriting. Just a few lines. Going to see Mark about the car. Might be late. Leftovers in the fridge. It was an ordinary note. The kind we'd exchanged for years. But it read differently now, like a placeholder for a conversation that neither of us wanted to have. I reheated soup and ate alone at the table. The silence wasn't heavy this time, it was just there, like furniture. I cleaned up carefully, making sure everything was in its place. As evening fell, I stepped out onto the porch again. The bench looked darker in the fading light, almost like it belonged to another time. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and sat, hoping the quiet would offer clarity. It didn't. He never came out. The lights in his house stayed off. The yard remained still. Eventually, I stood and walked back inside, locking the door behind me. I moved through the house with slow, deliberate steps, pausing at windows, checking the front gate, adjusting the position of a picture frame that hadn't been touched in months. In the bedroom, I changed into night clothes and lay on top of the covers. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't reach for a book. I stared at the ceiling, letting the stillness settle over me like a blanket. At some point, I drifted into sleep. When I woke, the room was dark and the house completely silent. I turned my head slowly, expecting to see my husband beside me. But the bed was empty. I sat up, heart beginning to quicken. The hallway light was off. The guest room door was closed. I listened for footsteps, for the sound of a car outside, but there was nothing. I walked downstairs, checking the locks, glancing through the windows. No sign of him. The note on the counter was still there, unchanged. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the cool glass pressed between my palms. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. I wasn't tracking time. Then, quietly, the front door opened. He stepped inside, keys in hand, coat damp from the lingering mist outside. He looked surprised to see me still awake, but not alarmed. "You're up," he said. I nodded. Couldn't sleep. He set down his keys, slipped off his shoes, and moved past me toward the stairs. "Everything okay?" I asked. He paused halfway up. "Yeah. Just a long day." And then he disappeared down the hall. I remained at the table, watching the space where he'd just been, the finality of his steps pressing into the floorboards. I didn't know where he'd been. I didn't know why it mattered. But for the first time in a long while, I felt the strange sensation of being a stranger in my own house. I stood eventually, turned off the lights, and made my way to bed. The sheets were cool, the room still. He was already under the covers, turned away from me. I lay down beside him, staring at the dark. And I realized this wasn't about him anymore. It hadn't been for a while. The next few days passed with the uneasy rhythm of something unresolved. Not an argument, not a confession, not even a shift in routine, but a quiet, unmistakable difference in the air, like the weight of something unsaid pressing lightly against every surface of the house. We moved around each other with practiced familiarity, exchanging morning greetings, updates on errands, the occasional comment about the weather, but all of it had the quality of a script, recited from memory without heart. I didn't see him. Not in the yard. Not at the bench. His windows remained closed, curtains drawn. I thought, more than once, about walking over. About leaving a note, like before. But the idea felt juvenile now, misplaced. Whatever had passed between us, it had left us both quieter. Less sure. One afternoon, I found myself standing by the garden fence, pretending to inspect a sagging tomato vine. The sun was hot on my back, the air thick with late summer moisture. I hoped, maybe foolishly, that he would be there. That something in the world would lean toward me just enough to let the silence break. But nothing stirred. No sound from the other side. Just wind brushing the trees and the faint buzz of an unseen lawnmower in the distance. That evening, I found my husband in the garage, sorting through old boxes. He said he was looking for a tool, something he hadn't used in years. But the way he sifted through the items, half-focused, slow, told me he wasn't really searching. He just needed to be alone. And I didn't ask questions. Later, while washing the dishes, I noticed something on the windowsill. A smudge. Faint, almost invisible, like a fingerprint on glass. I wiped it clean with the corner of a towel, but it lingered in my thoughts. I had no reason to feel watched. No reason to be uneasy. And yet, there it was, an echo of something I couldn't explain. That night, my dreams were full of noise. Doors opening and closing. Voices calling from distant rooms. I woke just before dawn, breath shallow, heart unsettled. My husband was still asleep, turned toward the wall. Unable to lie still, I rose and walked quietly down the stairs. I didn't know where I was going until I found myself in the kitchen again, barefoot on cold tile, staring at the bench through the darkened window. It was empty. Still. As if it had never meant anything at all. I brewed coffee mechanically, letting the scent fill the space. I didn't drink it right away. I just stood there, hands around the mug, waiting. When morning light finally bled into the sky, I stepped outside. The air was cool, the grass wet under my soles. I walked to the bench, sat down, and closed my eyes. It had all started so simply. A glance. A fall. A conversation over herbs. But what it awakened in me, what it revealed, was something far deeper than a single kiss or a night spent beneath the hum of candlelight. It was the realization that I had gone quiet inside long before any of this began. That my life had narrowed into predictable corridors, and I had walked them without noticing the doors I'd stopped opening. When I opened my eyes again, I saw something that made my breath catch. On the bench beside me, under a small folded napkin, was a photo. It was old. Faded. A Polaroid. Me, years ago, sitting on the edge of a dock in the same summer dress I had once forgotten I owned. Knees tucked under my chin, hair windblown, face half turned toward the light. I didn't remember who took it. But I knew he had it now. I held it gently, afraid it might disintegrate under pressure. There was no note attached. Just the image. Just me, frozen in a moment I barely remembered, now returned by someone who had seen something in it worth holding on to. I stared at it for a long time before folding the napkin back over and slipping it into my pocket. Then I rose and walked back to the house. Inside, the world resumed its script. My husband came down for breakfast. We talked about errands. The garbage needed to go out. The sink was slow again. Nothing unusual. But under my skin, the picture pulsed with meaning. That afternoon, I walked to the community center library to return a book I hadn't finished. The streets were familiar, the sidewalks cracked in the same places they always were. I passed the grocery store, the small cafe where I used to meet friends. Everything was unchanged. And yet I walked differently. Aware of the quiet tension within me, of something opening that couldn't be closed again. When I came home, I found my husband in the kitchen, flipping through a magazine. He looked up when I entered, his expression neutral. "You were out," he said. "I went to the library," I replied. He nodded and went back to his pages. But the way he watched me when I walked past him, the way his eyes followed my movements more carefully than usual, it made something tighten in my chest. That evening, as I put laundry away, I found something unexpected in the drawer beside our bed. A receipt. Folded neatly. From a restaurant I didn't recognize. 2 meals. A bottle of wine. Dated 3 nights ago. I stood there holding it for a long time, the corners digging lightly into my skin. I didn't ask. Not that night. Instead, I went downstairs, made tea, and sat on the couch while my husband watched a rerun of a show we'd both seen before. I sipped slowly, feeling the paper still in my pocket like a stone. I didn't know who he had dinner with. I didn't know if I wanted to. Later, when he went to bed early, I stayed behind, turning off each lamp one by one, until only the kitchen light remained. I pulled the photo from my pocket and placed it on the counter. Then I turned off the light. The final morning came softly, wrapped in a kind of stillness that felt more like closure than calm. The air had a strange texture to it, clear, quiet, almost weightless. I woke alone. The bed beside me was cold, already made. There was no note on the nightstand, no sound of water running, no clinking of dishes from the kitchen. Just sunlight slipping across the hardwood floor in clean, pale lines. I sat up slowly, feeling the residue of the previous night still clinging to my skin. I had slept poorly, haunted not by dreams, but by the steady presence of everything unspoken. The receipt still sat in my drawer, tucked beneath a scarf I hadn't worn in years. The photo was gone. I had taken it upstairs before bed, folded it carefully, and placed it between the pages of a book I no longer planned to finish. Downstairs, the house was tidy. Almost too tidy. The kind of order that suggested someone had come and gone without trying to leave a trace. I opened the curtains. The sky was cloudless. The bench in the yard was empty. I made tea out of habit more than desire. The warmth of the mug against my fingers felt grounding. I drank it slowly, sitting at the table, letting the silence settle around me without resistance. I didn't expect him to appear. Not anymore. The space between our houses had grown wider in the past week, not in distance, but in everything else. What had begun as something simple, human, and unplanned had turned into a mirror I hadn't wanted to look into, and now, I couldn't look away. I thought about the version of myself from just a month ago. The woman who moved through her home like a shadow, who folded laundry without memory, who watered dead plants hoping they'd come back to life. I wasn't her anymore. But I wasn't someone new either. I was something in between. By mid-morning, I started cleaning again. Not to erase, but to make space. I moved through each room deliberately, wiping surfaces, discarding clutter. I pulled old photo frames from drawers and dusted them. Some I returned to shelves. Others I left behind. At one point, while rearranging the books in the living room, I found a notebook tucked between 2 hard covers. It was mine, though I barely remembered writing in it. Inside were lists, unfinished thoughts, a few forgotten recipes, and a note to myself from a year ago that stopped me cold. Don't wait for something to change. Become the change you miss. I didn't remember writing it. But I knew exactly what it meant. I closed the notebook and set it on the coffee table. Outside, the neighbor's car was gone. His house was dark. The porch was clean. The chair that used to sit beneath the window was no longer there. I wondered if he'd taken it inside. Or taken it with him. Around noon, my husband returned home. He walked into the kitchen with a plastic grocery bag in one hand and a newspaper in the other. He greeted me with a casual nod, his eyes scanning the counters. "You eat?" he asked. "Not yet." He pulled out a carton of eggs, a loaf of bread, some fruit. He placed them in the fridge, closed the door, and began to rinse an apple under the faucet. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. I stood beside the sink, watching the water run, unsure how to find the language I didn't even know I needed. "I found a receipt," I said. He looked up, slowly. "What receipt?" I paused. "From dinner." You didn't mention it. His expression didn't change. He dried his hands and set the apple on the counter. Then he leaned back against the edge of the sink and crossed his arms. I had dinner with someone. Yes. He said it without hesitation, without apology. I waited. But he didn't elaborate. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Would it have changed anything? The question landed like a stone. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. I don't think we see each other anymore, I said quietly. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue. I think we stopped a long time ago, he replied. And that was it. No shouting. No tears. Just two people acknowledging what had long been true. The rest of the day passed quietly. We moved around each other like echoes. We said only what needed to be said. That evening, I walked to the bench one last time. The air was cooler now, and the sun dipped lower behind the trees. I sat there, letting the breeze wrap around me. I didn't expect him to come. And he didn't. I stayed until the light began to fade, then stood, brushing dust from my skirt. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a note for him. It wasn't anything dramatic. Just a line I had written for myself, borrowed from my old notebook. I placed it under the edge of the bench, weighed down with a small stone. Then I walked back to the house, not looking back. Inside, the lights were on. My husband was packing a small overnight bag. He looked at me as I entered, then at the bag, then back again. I'll stay at Mark's tonight, he said. Give us both some space. I nodded. That was all. He left 20 minutes later. I didn't watch him go. The sound of the door closing behind him felt final, but not painful. I made tea again, sat at the table, and looked around the house. It was the same house. But I wasn't the same woman. I didn't know what came next. I didn't need to. I had already returned to myself.